Hello, everyone. My name is Lucas, and I'm going to talk to you about some development practices. And maybe to start off with, I'll introduce myself briefly and put some background and tell you why I'm here. So I recently started working for a social media startup called Global Dawn. It's a medium-sized startup and a team, and basically we're just developing single-page JavaScript applications. And before, I was the core engineering team of BBC, so completely different environment, large organization, biggest broadcaster in the world. Prior to that, some user interface designing, again, big company, different country, different culture. So basically designing, well, not designing, but developing interfaces for airlines. And in my time, I also did some agency work, which was in the office and also distributed. So I was working online and on various client projects. And just in case you're wondering why am I boring you with my CV, is just to introduce the context, meaning that during my career I was working in so many diverse environments, from massive corporations and to small agencies and even like single-person projects. But I could, when I retrospect now, I can cherry pick like the best practices I thought were great for improving team performance. However, before I move on, I need to start with a quote, as you do. So you have to know that I'm not trying to impose anything, and because the practices are discovered, you can't really define them, so it's a very tricky thing, and you just need to work out what's best for your team and experiment a lot. So every time I join a new team, I had a lot of expectations. First of all, I'm focusing on delivering quality. To me, very important, even over a deadline, is delivering a great product. And I don't really enjoy sacrificing quality over a deadline. And obviously, I want to develop my skills, work with the newest technologies, be able to experiment with the new stuff, not working too much, obviously. And I'm also, which I found was very difficult at massive corporations, I also try to influence what I'm doing and just to contribute as much as I can into the process. Obviously, having a lot of fun and becoming rich at the same time. But I quickly realized that it's not really possible. So first concept I came across and I found really influential and would like to focus my talk on was pair programming, which basically is a technique when two programmers sit at the same workstation and one is the driver who basically types in code while the other just reviews the code line by line as it's being typed. And if you're doing test-driven development, you can do you can experiment with that form quite a lot. Like, for example, there's something called adversarial programming, which basically means that one person writes a test and the other one just writes an implementation, just a code that makes the test pass. What are the benefits I found was, the most important one was continuous code review. So when you develop a product, it's crucial, I think, to detect bugs as soon as possible, because if you hold on, most of the projects are like that line. So if you come closer to the deadline you come, the more you focus on bugs you are. And I found that in roughly maybe 95% of the projects, 2 weeks before the deadline, suddenly everyone is just trying to solve all of the bugs, and it's complete chaos. So having practices in place that really help you to decrease the amount of bugs is quite necessary. And when you when you pair program, you do a code review as you go. So because there are 2 people working on it, so it also helps building cross-functional teams. I think there's like an anecdote saying how many developers need to leave the projects for it to fail. And the worst case scenario is really 1, because if you have really focused teams and one person knows about one feature, other person knows about some other feature, then when that person leaves the team, you face a problem with learning his code, and it all takes time. So when you pair program with many different developers, it comes to knowing the product much better, because every person pretty much worked with every bit of a project. Also, I'm not a big fan of that distinction that you have in teams. Like, for example, I'm a backend or I'm a front-end developer. I think that can cause harm to teams. And where ideally you should have, for example, if you have a project that builds a Java API and then it feeds that API into some user interfaces written in JavaScript, ideally everyone could and should be should be able to work on both sides of a project. Not many people are fans of such views, but that's just an ideal. It also leads to better architecture, less code, and because while you pair program, the other person is reviewing all the time. So you can basically improve and brainstorm on what are the best architectural decisions while you do it. And also you don't waste time on Facebook or Twitter, so the team discipline is much better because you focus on actually doing something. However, there are many things to watch out for, because it's not good for all of the use cases. So primarily, it has to be used with care, because I think it's a perfect solution when it comes to new features, when some architectural decisions have to be made. However, if it's just some mundane task when you need to, for example, I don't know, cut a PSD into an HTML, that might not be very beneficial, because you will probably double the time of development. Also, it's worth mixing experience levels, because you don't really want 2 novices working, pairing together, because you won't know what the fuck's going on. So it's quite a tricky thing and needs to be well balanced. It's also, I noticed sometimes that developers have problems with communicating their thoughts. So even if they pair program, they tend to not to speak to each other, really. So a good idea to overcome that might be to convince or just convince a developer to speak their thoughts aloud, which basically helps to communicate, and the other person can pick up what's going on quite easily, which leads to problems with disengagement. So I was a witness myself that I saw a person just falling asleep during pair programming, because one was so focused on the code that the other one just dazed off. So you have to be careful and mix those things. Change a lot, because that's another important factor. If you do pair programming, you have to switch roles quite often. Next thing is having standards. No shit. Well, basically, but not only having standards, but also imposing them. When I join a team, I don't really care if you want to put your quotes here, or if you want to close the line here, or use commas, or double space, or four spaces. That's not really important unless you agree on what works for your team best, agree on one standard, and then just impose it, being strict and persistent. So the perfect solution would be just to not allow any non-standard code to be swept under the carpet, really, which helps when you pair program, when you do code reviews. But you can automate that process using machines to do the job quite easily, because you have stuff like JSLint or JSHint, which can be set up and integrated into your projects. So it's quite important to integrate them with a build process. Basically, the best way of imposing, from my experience, was making the build break when the standards are not met. So every time somebody checks in code and which is a non-standard by the team, the build just breaks and can't be released. Another very important thing is writing tests. I know there was a talk about tests, but to those of you who's not attended, basically the idea is that first you write a test that fails, and then you write the code, but just the amount of code to make that test pass, no more really. And then you go to refactoring, and you just repeat that process all the time. So you write another test, watch it fail, write some code that passes it, add it to your code base, and then refactor. But it's also very important to automate that process, because having just manual tests doesn't really help a team. So first of all, it's a very good idea, in my opinion, to write acceptance tests with your customer. So for example, if you're using behavior-driven development, just drag your customer, product owner, or client into the project and let him join the test writing process, so you know all the time what the acceptance criteria are. And also, integrate as frequently as possible. So once you have a code but you think it's worth checking in, just check in and build. And as I mentioned before, tests should really be automated, because otherwise, what's the point of having them? Every time you write a code, and same with the standards, if the build contains broken tests that fail, then it should fail as well, as simple as that. Because you don't want, it helps fixing, like finding regression issues, and again, helps catching bugs really, really early in the process. And if you integrate quite often, you always have a version to fall back on. So there's a working version on the server, and you write some code, build it, and it fails, but you can easily fall back to your working version. There are a couple of other practices I would like to mention here, which is delivering your code in very short iterations. So the concept behind this is basically that you don't write huge chunks of code and wait with releasing them until like late in the project, but you basically write code in iterations. Like, for example, you have 1 week iteration, and every week you do a demo of what you've done to the client, customer, a bit like Scrum, for example. But I don't want to use the names of any frameworks, because, again, really what works best for your team is good. So that's a really simple idea, and connected with pair programming, writing tests, continuous integration, and building. It helps, again, to catch issues very early in the process, and helps the business and the customer to give you feedback straight away. Because a major problem with manual testing or long release cycles is that, or if you say you have a QA team that handles the test, is the major issue with that is a really long feedback process, and you want that feedback straight away, which leads to communicating with product owners. Again, if you have short cycles, you should communicate with the owner as much as possible, even if you don't like changes in the projects, because I know people just think they should have a spec and just do whatever the 60 pages of that spec say and just give the project to sign off. However, you will have a lot of changes, and it always happens. And if it's late in the process, it's very difficult to implement them. You should also experiment as much as possible, because that's really how the practices are discovered. So don't be afraid if you try to introduce some methodology and it just fails, because that's basically the main reason to do so. It takes a lot of time to actually find something that works, and it's also very difficult when the team changes and there are people shifts all the time. So you have that three elements of the team, which is at first the team is just forming, so they don't really know each other, and then there's a storming period when they started to know each other but don't really agree with each other, and after that it really comes performing. So experimentation is the key to go to the performing stage and just find that holy grail. And most importantly, you should socialize as much as possible, because yeah, you should go to parties, dinners, organize as many social events as you can with your team, because it's not only about business relations, but also about knowing the people outside of the office or outside of your work tasks. And I'm quite sure you all attend like meetings like Meet.js because you're here. But I'm quite sure, from what I remember, there are still towns in Poland, like, for example, Gdańsk or Trójmiasto, where there are no Meet.js meetings. So if you can, I think it's worth trying of organizing such events, even if like a couple people come, that's great. So that's pretty much all I wanted to. I rushed it a bit, so it's 3 minutes shorter, 5 minutes shorter. So do you have any questions? Yes.
Actually, I have two questions.
Okay.
The first is you use the term such as shock iteration. What do you mean telling shock iterations? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks?
Well, it really depends on your team. Previously, we had 2 week because when I worked at the BBC, it was they were using Scrum and they were like conforming to Scrum rules quite a lot, and the iterations were 2 weeks there. Now we're working in 1 week iterations on a startup, but it really depends on the kind of your product and how often do you want to release your software. So you just have to again experiment and find out what's best for you.
Okay, and the second question, thank you. What about small teams? I mean, the pair programming is a great thing. We do pair programming on a usual basis in my company.
Mm-hmm.
But I also used to work in companies which were like, I don't know, 10 people out. So the pair programming is almost impossible.
What do you mean, like 10 people development team?
Yeah.
Well, you can have 5 pairs, so so it is possible. But you might want to experiment with a different process. Like if you use GitHub, for example, you can just branch off your code really and make a pull request for somebody else to review. As long as the code reviews are maintained and there is no code at least 2 developers are happy with, checked into your master branch, that should be fine. But I think 10 people is enough to experiment with pairing. Okay.
Okay. The most common issue with test-driven development is that some people say it's impossible to create tests for some requirements. You didn't mention any technique to check the requirements that are unable to be automated with tests. Do you have anything to say on that topic?
But can you give like an example of?
Well, it's the most common example is an interface behavior, or some just things that can't be easily automatically tested, like really drag and drop used to be a good example, but nowadays there are frameworks. But let's assume that it's a good enough example. How do we test those requirements that we can't automate, or we can't automate cheaply?
Okay, well, I mentioned having tests in general. I might have said TDD, but that's just one of the pieces of the puzzle, really. Because, for example, interfaces can be tested as well. You can use, for example, stuff like Selenium, or you can just use headless browsers and run your test tools like in headless browsers. And
What if you can't automate a test or a criteria?
Right. I'm not really sure if I understand, because I'm trying to think of a situation when you can't really automate your tests. But
Right, so this is a different one. First of all, I'm really surprised to hear about pair programming. After so many years, it was actually quite popular a long time ago. So my question is, how many people, how big team should be, in your experience, to start actually using pair programming and see benefits of it? For example, because if you have 4 people and you pair them, so you basically are cutting your team in half, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what was the size? I imagine that you have used pair programming, I don't know, in BBC, maybe in previous companies?
Yeah.
So what was the size of the team and what are the benefits?
Well, I've never worked in a team, well, even in like such large organization like the BBC, which has like 20,000 people working there. I've never worked in a team before that was more than 10 people, because it's impossible to manage such a team, I think. And you run into serious problems with management. So the teams are mostly split into sub-teams anyway. So I think I've never worked in teams of more than 10, and the pair programming was being practiced quite efficiently in a team of 8 or 10. I'm not sure about 4 people. As you say, that would be quite difficult because you split your team in half. So again, as I said before, it's a matter of experiment and actually trying to figure out what works for you best. Because sometimes it just doesn't work. It's not, it's not a holy grail.
And also, that probably depends also on the size of the project.
Well, it depends on many factors, really. Size of the project, if you're working with third-party solutions, if you design architecture for that product, and there are many things to consider, really.
When you were migrating or when you were implementing the pair programming in a team, have you encountered any resistance, and what did you deal with it?
Well, at the beginning, there's always people are like, what's that hippie shit? But after a while, when they actually try and see the effects of pair programming, that they actually do stuff quite quickly. Well, I was a bit skeptical as well at the beginning, because I thought like, well, I want to, have my computer to myself. But after trying it, after a couple of sessions, I found it like really useful. And in the teams I were practicing it, everyone pretty much was the same. And so from being a bit resilient to actually advocating pair programming. And at the BBC, after a month or 2, we actually came into situations when it didn't really have to be imposed because people were trying to find a pair to work on all the time. So it became like a natural process.
I have a question about enforcing coding standards with JSLint. What would you do if you are joining a team which already has lots of code? They're using continuous integration, but if you start enabling JSLint and make build to fail, everybody will hate you. So what would you do in this situation?
Well, I would try to, that's a tricky question, really. I would probably try to impose, or just, because you can configure JSLint. It's not that you have to have all of those options turned on from the very start. So you can introduce those things like gradually. You can configure to suit the project's needs. But first, I think you would need to organize a meeting with your team and really agree what the standards are. And JSLint is just one of the tools, and you can maybe just use some other stuff or just build really your own parser that will check the code if it conforms to the standards you agreed on, if that answers your question.
I would like to ask about writing acceptance test with customer. How it looks like? You don't have any code, any mockups, and you have to write some test, show your customer that all are with the red color, and then you are telling to customer that, oh, when we will done, you will see all are red, all are green?
No, I might have confused you a bit, and see now. Because what I meant by writing acceptance tests with the client is to basically meet and write acceptance criteria for BDD. So when, for example, when I click on this button, then something happens. So it's, it's plain English.
This is some requirements.
Yes. It's just writing the requirements down, and then the developers or test developers or developers in test, whatever you call them, just integrate those requirements into your behavior.
Okay, thanks.
There was a question here from Kamil.
You may have answered this already. I may have not heard it. But how often do you per program? When? In what circumstances? Because I guess it's not happening full time for each programmer, or is it?
At the BBC, it was a full-time thing. So basically, I would say most of the code was per-programmed.
And product managers are just okay with it?
Yes, because as I said before, it was. I didn't say that. I said my dream team was to joining a team that really puts quality over a deadline. And I was just lucky enough to be in such an environment that if the deadline was coming close, but the quality was poor, that would just exceed the deadline. So the managers are quite happy. And actually there's a common misconception, because people think when you pair program, you double the time of development. But there were some, I think at the University of Utah, there was some research done, and the actual time that was longer than one person was doing it was only 30%, which was basically what you gained later on shorter tests and shorter feedback cycles.
Okay, one question, one more.
Anyone? There's someone here.
You have already mentioned about switching in pair programming, and from your experience, how much time do you need to switch, or is needed to switch? How often do you switch, of course?
Well, switch between two people?
Switch by the main coder, I mean. The main one in front of the keyboard.
Oh, okay. Well, it's not really time-based, I would say, because previously, when I was practicing it basically, very often it looked in a way that one person was writing a test, and the other person was trying to make that test pass. So it's not really, dependent on time. It's just as long as it really takes, and you just switch. But if you don't do it that way, then you just have to agree and see what works for your colleague best. And if you see him getting tired or annoyed, then you can just take over.
Okay, thank you.
There's a lot of questions. There's one there.
You said something about socializing, and I have a question.
Okay. There is a party afterwards. Yeah?
No, not in this way. In your opinion, is it better to work with someone you know and like your friend, or with a stranger, just colleague?
I think it's much better to work with a person you actually know, because then you are more open towards that person, and it's just easier for me. I find it just easier. Every time I joined a new team, it took like a month or two to really start performing better, whilst when I met the people better. So it's just my experience. I don't know.
Imagine that you are working on some module. Do you have one pair of programmers working on this module, or do you mix the pair? So not two people, but for example, 4 people will work on the same module day by day.
I think the best thing is just to mix as much as you can, so that pretty much every person in the team knows the module and knows how to work with it and what's the code base. Because then, when one developer leaves the team, you don't have a problem of people not knowing what's going on in the project. So.